Today on Everyday Injustice, we have the story of Vilasni Ganesh. Vilasni has been going through a very interesting case, unfortunately very frustrating on her end. And I'm going to let her and her attorney, Lisa Rasmussen, talk about it. So maybe you can describe just basic facts of the case, and then we can go into some of the details.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for allowing me to talk and giving me an opportunity to speak about my case of extreme injustice that has happened to me. I was wrongfully accused of crimes I did not commit, and I was wrongfully indicted of crimes. And there was a lot of prosecutor misconduct in my case, where prosecutors accused me of healthcare fraud crimes by creating enormous false fraudulent evidence of on or about 40,000 false patient records, billings, claims from an entirely different doctor's office during the course. And they tried to force me to take a plea deal. I refused to take a plea deal. I decided to prove my innocence through going to a jury trial. And we went to jury trial, and the prosecutors were not able to prove their case or the theory of healthcare fraud. Patients gave stellar testimonials, told the truth, said Dr. Ganesh provided highest quality of medical care. Insurance company, SIU agents, including Aetna, Anthem, they said that Dr. Ganesh, insurance companies refused payments to Dr. Ganesh. And also my office staff said Dr. Ganesh never told us to lie to the insurance companies. Dr. Ganesh did not give us instructions to submit fraudulent claims to insurance companies. And since my case involves 4 major insurance companies, out of which 2 had initiated the case, which is Anthem and Aetna. And those 2 companies actually that owed me a lot of back payments or past due payments for prior years before the indictment. And there's no Medicare, Medicaid, or government funded programs included, which is a normal case when a physician gets accused of a healthcare fraud. Normally, it starts with Medicaid, strike fraud, strike force. But in my case, there was no Medicare, there was no Medicaid, and government funded programs. And Medicare, Medicaid gave a letter to the court before the trial saying that they're completely excluding themselves from the trial and from the legal proceedings because they did not find any evidence of fraud, neither with Dr. Ganesh nor with Dr. Belcher, who's my husband, a co-defendant in this case. So
wait, pause a sec if you don't mind.
Sure.
So Lisa, maybe you can give us I don't know, a 2-line synopsis of the case, just so that we don't dive into the weeds immediately here.
Yes, I can. So this is a healthcare fraud prosecution. Dr. Ganesh is right. It did not involve any fraud claims alleged by the government, which is the normal course. And that would be claims submitted to Medicaid or Medicare. It seemed to start with the fact that she was not getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars by some of these private insurers. And then she would submit a batch of claims, wouldn't get paid, she'd resubmit them. Apparently they got irritated. They went to the government and said, we think she's committing fraud, and the government prosecuted her. So the hundreds of thousands of dollars in claims for all the work that she did remains unpaid. And now she's supposed to pay them hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's kind of one of the many injustices in this case. So that's the overview of what the case is. I have a lot of knowledge about the kind of fraudulent evidence that the government submitted during trial, and I'm happy to dive into that whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I just want to kind of ferret out the basics of the case so that the people listening have kind of a good solid grasp of that before we get into what the government did wrong, which looks like it's pretty substantial as well. So what is she facing at this point? I mean, are they asking her to pay this money back, or are they actually seeking prison time for this? Or both?
So she's already been sentenced. She's been on release pending appeal. She's been sentenced to 63 months. Her husband, Dr. Belcher, was sentenced to 12 months and 1 day. Those sentences are going to be imposed. Her self-surrender date is November 10th, I believe, and his is in January. Dr. Belcher's is in January. There was an appeal done to the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit affirmed in its own very bizarre proceeding. And I am going to be filing a petition for cert on Dr. Ganesh's behalf to the US Supreme Court based on some Sixth Amendment claims that she has, her right to counsel claims. But as it stands right now, she's been sentenced to 63 months and she has to start serving her sentence on November 10th.
So this all seems very convoluted to me, and I'm not a novice in this, although I haven't done a lot of fraud cases because normally, you know, it's kind of blue collar crime, if you were. But I mean, is this a typical case, or is this highly unusual from your perspective?
Well, healthcare fraud cases are not untypical. This case is atypical because it doesn't involve any payments by the government. So there was no fraud relating to payments by Medicare or Medicaid. It's a private insurer. So if you think about it from that lens, if private insurers owe doctors money for the services they perform, right? Because we as insureds, we purchase insurance through the market, or we have it through our employer, and we depend on going to the doctor and having insurance cover that doctor visit. And if the insurance didn't cover it, we would say to the insurance company, why aren't you paying for the visit? So in this case, the insurance actually didn't pay for the visit, but they never told the patient that the insurance wasn't covered. Instead, they just didn't pay Dr. Ganesh. And then it appears that to avoid paying her, they went to the government and said, we think there's fraud, so we're not paying her. And then they caused the government to then investigate. And then the government came up with a theory that she had billed for some patients on a date different than the date she may have seen them, and that she may have billed for a higher code than what she substantiated with the documentation. They came up with 5 of those patients is what she was convicted of, where it was either a different date than the date she performed the service, and they thought the code was too high. So there's like, when you first go to a doctor, it might be you have a really thorough visit because you haven't seen that doctor before, but if you follow up 2 months later because you have strep throat, it might be a different code. So these insurance companies, from what I can tell, and I came in at the point of the direct appeal, appear to have benefited in a windfall, really, by avoiding paying her hundreds of thousands of dollars that was due to her, and then getting her convicted so they never have to pay her, if that makes sense. And then the government, in its own way, also kind of participated in this charade, if you will. And then there's also this additional layer of the issues that she had at trial with her counsel.
So we'll get to that in 1 second. But so what it sounds like to me, that you're claiming that the actual fraud here is actually being perpetrated by the insurance companies, and the government's helping them do that.
Correct.
And so, okay. So let's kind of walk through this, Dr. Ganesh, if you don't mind. So how did you first learn that this was happening? I mean, what was your first point of contact?
You know, my first point of contact is when, federal agents just randomly showed up to my office and started talking to me and my staff. And after a few minutes of casual conversation, they said to me, they came into my office and they said, um, you have to give us a confession. I said, confession for what? What do I have to confess? Oh, because insurance companies are accusing you of fraud and you have to confess it's fraud. I said, I will never confess. I did not fraud the insurance company. Insurance company defrauded me. And in fact, in months before, I told them, look, I have contacted the California Medical Association because I tried to get the payments and insurance companies are not paying me. They refused my payments and denied all the claims. So I approached the California Medical Association. They gave me 2 attorneys who are healthcare law attorneys. One was Mr. Rocky Delgadillo in LA Medical. He was a chief of LA Medical County and very reputable civil healthcare attorney. And they also gave Miss Heather Gibson, who was much closer to my office in Northern California Bay Area. And Miss Heather Gibson is also a fantastic civil litigation attorney. And I said, I have sought help from California Medical Association, and I have 2 civil healthcare lawyers who are really good, credible lawyers who have evaluated all these claims, who has seen that the insurance company is the one that's defrauding me. And they have filed civil lawsuit litigation against the insurance company because we had a credible case. And my case was filed in the Superior Court of State of California in the Santa Clara County with insurance civil litigation against Aetna and Anthem for not paying me for a couple of years for numerous thousands of patients. And they had submitted, the lawsuit was filed and there were documents submitted to show proof that this is what happened. So I said, why would you ask me to confess for something like that when they defrauded me? And, I have even a proof of civil litigation. So I
know you want to tell your whole story at once here, but it helps if we do this in little pieces so that the people listening can digest it.
Right.
So according to what I'm seeing here, it looks like they charged you in 2016 and some of these claims went back as far as 2012.
Correct.
Okay. Correct. And you ended, at what point did they end up bringing you to court? Was that 2016? Is that what happened?
That's right. 2016 is when that happened, was the grand jury indictment. And in the meantime, when the agents came a few months before then, just a couple of months before then, I don't remember exactly the months, but they came a few months before. And also they threatened my office staff to give confessions. And I refused to give a confession and they said the same thing because they know what was going on. And so then they left.
Now, what agency was this?
This was the FBI agents.
So how did, and Lisa, maybe you can explain this. How does this end up going federal immediately?
So almost all healthcare fraud, well, I won't say, that's not even right, because I have seen some of it prosecuted by state AG offices. But generally speaking, healthcare fraud, there's a federal jurisdiction nexus because it almost always involves Medicaid or Medicare, which is federally funded. In this case, it doesn't. But the federal nexus would be that these insurance companies, Blue Cross, Anthem, Cigna, they operate at a national level. So there would be federal jurisdiction based on the claims being submitted through wires and mail and things like that.
So then this goes to trial in federal court when 2018?
It goes in October 2017.
2017.
And then the trial itself lasts several months because they only do trial on certain days. So it starts in October, ends in December. Notably, both Dr. Belcher and Dr. Ganesh were acquitted of the most serious charges against them, which were the healthcare fraud conspiracy charges and money laundering. They were also charged with money laundering. They were acquitted of all of that. Dr. Belcher was convicted of a single count of a false statement based on performing a service on a different date like November 23rd versus November 25th and what was on the claim he submitted. He's got an issue on whether or not that's any even material. And then Dr. Ganesh was convicted of 10 counts based on 5 single acts. So the way that can happen is there's a charge for false statement, and then there's a charge for healthcare fraud. But so she gets convicted of 10 counts based on 5 acts.
So I'm always kind of suspicious when I see these kind of mixed verdicts, because it tells me that you know, the prosecution is either reaching or there's something wrong with the case, because you know, if you have a nice clean case, you're either going to get conviction or you're going to get an acquittal. And if you don't, then there's something weird going on, in my opinion. And I've seen this a lot in the criminal cases that we do, where the prosecution's overreaching on some of the charges, but it's almost like the jury wants to, they think something happened, so they want to convict on something. So that's always a big red flag to me. But I mean, describe what happened at trial and what happened with your attorney. I know you have a complaint against ineffective defense.
Yes. My my trial attorney was extremely ineffective. He was, in fact, horrific. And initially, he had a website and he advertised himself as a healthcare expert lawyer, as a great defense attorney, and he had experiences in healthcare fraud. And most importantly, he said he in his website he said he never lost a case. And then when we met with him, he said he's never lost a case. But we were so naive about the criminal justice system. Myself and my brother, we went and met with him, and then my mom. But he talked so much about how great he was and how he hasn't lost any trial. But then we believed him, and he said, pay me a retainer for $100,000, and I will start working on getting experts and whatnot, and accounting experts, auditing experts. Since the most important thing in this case is when the government prosecutors bring these type of cases, there's usually one or more medical billing expert who testify in trial and talk about the fraud, which the government did not hire a single medical billing expert. And also other legal experts have told me that's a misconduct in itself, and the government does not hire a medical billing expert to show the fraudulent claims. That's a big problem. That's a prosecutorial misconduct in itself. And so that's what they did. And he said auditing experts. Government didn't have any auditing experts. So he promised that he was going to do all the stuff that the government had failed to do. And he took $100,000, and then he went on vacation. And he never showed up to any court hearings for almost 1 year. And he had a attorney who was a special appearing attorney who did not know about the case, and finally the judge kind of yelled at and kicked her out. So finally he got involved almost a year after he was retained, and he started something that was so really nonsensical, what's called an insanity defense. And I completely opposed it. I said, you have to be interviewing witnesses, you should be taking witness testimonies, you should be bringing calling the insurance companies and get them as witnesses. You need to interview my office staff. He never interviewed a single witness. Even though he got paid for it, he never retained a billing expert. He never retained an audit expert. He did absolutely nothing. He just pocketed the money and went on vacation. And then, and also we paid him $50,000 first. And then my brother paid another extra $50,000 because he said, I need money urgently because a trial is coming up in a few months. So my brother gave him another $50,000. And the other problem was he was never, when I was, since, I had, attorneys help me from, civil litigation lawyers helped me from the California Medical Association, I reached out to them and said, look, my lawyer is not doing all these things he's supposed to do. What do I do? And one of the things that the civil litigation attorneys that they referred me to looked at my case and said, the answer to your question, why was it filed in federal court? Because they said, if it was because I already had a case in the in the civil court, Superior Court of California, and the state court, I had filed a case against the insurance company for fraud. So if the government files an indictment on that, it could possibly get dismissed because a judge is going to look at it and say, look, Dr. Ganesh came and said insurance company defrauded her and there's proof documents in here. I mean, I don't know, but that's possible. So they actually took this case to the federal system and filed the indictment there. So anyway, backtracking to my attorney, he did absolutely nothing. And then he started this insanity defense, which made absolutely no sense to me. And he also asked my mom and my brother to give false testimonies. And my mother refused to
Can
testify.
you
And
explain what this insanity defense entailed?
Do you want me to explain that?
Yeah, I think
go ahead, Lisa,
yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know why he did it. Like, I came in at the appeal, so I have the 30,000 foot view of this. But I can tell you, he spent all of his time in this case from January 2017, or maybe February, through September of 2017. And let's remember the trial started in October 2017, pursuing an insanity defense, which it appears, I don't know why he did it. It had no merit. It was a stupid strategy. And all it did was make the court mad. The government appears to have kind of like been involved in it to some extent, because they questioned her competency. They had her evaluated for competency. And I think what trial counsel may have, and it's Horowitz was the lawyer, what he may have intended to do, but I don't know because I wasn't in his brain, was say that she maybe has some mental health defenses, but that's different than insanity. Insanity is an incredibly hard, almost impossible burden to meet in the modern era. You have to establish that someone had no idea what they were doing when they were doing it. I have no idea how you'd establish that over this 4-year period of time alleged in the grand jury indictment.
Especially in this kind of case. I mean, it'd be one thing if, we had a murder case or something.
Right.
But, this is kind of really technical stuff.
It's to the point that, I even commented and said, this is nonsense. You're not doing any investigation. You're not interviewing any witnesses. You've interviewed 0 witnesses. You've gotten all this money, but you've done absolutely nothing. So I actually decided to terminate him. I went to court. I submitted a letter to the judges, and trial Judge Lucy Coe, and I requested a termination of my very ineffective lawyer. And I did mention that the lawyer took money over $100,000. He has not interviewed. It was in September, almost a month and a half before trial, 8 weeks before trial. I told the judge that he has not interviewed a single witness. He took money to hire a private investigator from my brother, about $50,000, and he's not hired anybody. And he's not doing anything to provide defense for me in my trial. And then the judge did not conduct an inquiry. And Lisa, I would like you to kind of explain about what that means, the Sixth Amendment rights violation. So I had 2 court hearings. And the second court hearing, I went with a retained attorney, Mr. Jinkerson, who was very highly recommended by my fellow colleagues, physician colleagues, and hospital staff. And he came in to represent me in trial because he knew how ineffective and horrible my trial attorney was. And during this time, even Judge Coe had criticized him for not filing any pre-trial defense motions. He filed absolutely nothing to defend me, nor he was working on any trial strategy, and he completely stopped communicating with me. So these are all the issues I had, and that's why I wanted to terminate him. And I decided to retain a new lawyer. And I went to court and said, hey, I have a new lawyer and I want to get him on my case before the trial. And it was 2 times. And Lisa can explain more on the Sixth Amendment rights, constitutional rights.
Right.
Yeah, Lisa, please go.
Yeah, so she's right. And like I said earlier, her initial trial counsel, Horowitz, spent really all of his energy, so to speak, all of his litigation that he did was involved in this insanity defense. And there were hearings and there were briefings. And then fast forward, you're in October, and actually in September is when the court said, no, you don't meet, you're competent, and you can put on someone at trial to say you have an insanity defense, but she's clearly competent. So somehow the insanity defense morphed into this competence issue, wasted all of this time. He hadn't done anything. So the first time she requests a new lawyer is in August, and the hearing actually gets held in early September. For reasons that I don't know, he then says that he needs to be appointed as CJA counsel because he spent all the money. So not only does he get maintained on the case as her lawyer, there's no inquiry done as to why he's not effective, what he has or hasn't done. And then the court appoints him as CJA counsel, which is, if you don't know, it's the Criminal Justice Act that authorizes people who are indigent to have court appointed counsel at the government expense. So, that happens in early September. And then in October, she again files a motion saying, I need a new lawyer. She brings the other proposed lawyer to court with her. And then that is denied because it's too close to the trial date. But no inquiry is ever made as to why she needs a new lawyer, what Mr. Horowitz did or did not do to prepare for trial, which, as it turns out, was really nothing. He didn't interview witnesses. He didn't understand the evidence well enough to explain to her what the government's evidence was. And then after the fact, we all know that the evidence was not evidence against her. It was some evidence fabricated by the government. So those are the first 2/3 of her Sixth Amendment right violations. The latter part happens at sentencing. It happens again. But I want to keep this in a chronological order here.
Well, why don't you jump into that, and then I'll backtrack.
Okay.
To my next question.
So she did successfully terminate Horowitz after the convictions, prior to sentencing. She had another lawyer that she retained. He actually quit her in March. And then she had court-appointed counsel again. And that counsel, I actually was working with Dr. Belcher at that point after he had been sentenced. And this is like April of 2018. And I tried to talk to the CJA counsel that she had been appointed in that time frame. And he wasn't really amenable to listening to what I was trying to tell him about the government's evidence and the problems with it. So she again decided to try and hire another lawyer. She found a very reputable lawyer out of Washington, D.C., Mark Schammel, who has a firm, Wombley Dixon, that had an office in San Francisco. So through his partners in San Francisco, he entered an appearance, did all the proper things, asked to appear as out-of-state counsel, was granted that opportunity. And then they had a hearing in front of the magistrate in August of 2018, prior to her sentencing, on the substitution of counsel, Mark Schammel for the CJA lawyer. And after an hour and a half of the magistrate talking to everyone, the court denied it for just absolutely inexplicable reasons. I'm so baffled by it. He didn't say that it was going to delay the sentencing. He didn't say I'm going to need more time. He said that he would be prepared. He said that he would be in San Francisco or in the Bay Area that day. He already had another hearing. And at the end of this hour and a half hearing, the magistrate said, I'm going to deny the motion to substitute counsel. And even her CJA lawyer said, I think she'd be better served by a new attorney. And so that was the third denial of her Sixth Amendment right to counsel. It's a mixed bag. That's a denial of her right to counsel, of her retained counsel of her choice. The others were a failure to make adequate inquiry as to the counsel she had at the time and whether or not counsel was doing an adequate job where she could proceed to trial. So it was this mixed bag of Sixth Amendment violations that just pervade everything.
I felt like, I was forced into trial with one of the worst lawyers And somehow the judges, decided to, the judge pretty much forced me into trial. And in the meantime, between the first and the second two court hearings for, for changing my lawyer or getting an effective lawyer, what happened was I also wrote to the American Medical Association letter about how, my civil litigation lawyers were on board and they were filing the case against insurance company because insurance company defrauded Dr. Ganesh. And those documents are all in a civil court litigation versus and the government and the insurance company turn it around, retaliate against me saying, oh, I committed fraud. It doesn't make any sense. So I sent all this information and also the 1099 payment issued, which showed very far completely contradicts what the government is saying. And I sent that information to AMA and I sent that information to my patients. And I was pleading for help from the AMA to say, look, my lawyer is not doing anything. What else can I do? Can you guys please step in and help me out? Because I'm a fellow physician and I'm innocent and I'm trying to prove my innocence and I'm facing so many roadblocks. And at that time, as soon as I wrote the letter a couple of days later, the prosecutors got and I did write about prosecutor misconduct happening in my case because I said, look, they, all of this is on record where they committed fraud on me and I have civil cases and civil attorneys and the government doing this on the other side. And I said, look, there is prosecutor misconduct. I don't know what they're going to bring on trial. And I was really nervous about that. I sensed that something was going to go very wrong with my trial. I knew that. And that's why I rushed in and got, new attorney. But in the meantime, when I wrote the letters to AMA and CMA and also the County Medical Society prosecutors, they both, Mr. Jeff Nedro and Mr. Delahanty, got extremely angry at me. And they went to court and said, demanded a bail revoke and say Dr. Ganesh is talking about the case to AMA and whatnot to her patients. And she's trying to be witness tampering. It was horrific. It was not witness tampering. I was pleading for help because I knew this attorney was going to railroad me in trial and I was going to lose the trial. I knew it. And I was pleading for help from the judges. I got seldom, they didn't care about me having an effective lawyer. So I reached out to the AMA and then asked them for help, and prosecutor turned that against me and tried to block my access to AMA and got a gag order from the judge again. And there was a bail revoke or court hearing between the first and the second time. So I was told that I cannot talk to the AMA, I cannot talk to anybody. And I felt it was a freedom of speech violation or First Amendment violations where I was not allowed to talk when I was just pleading for help and asking for help. So that was a very horrific thing that had happened to me, before the trial. So I was not allowed to talk. And then because of that, I also started calling civil rights attorney to see, look, can I get a civil rights attorney who can talk for me, who can say how my rights have been violated and how I've been, I'm like a slave. I have no way out of this. I mean, every avenue, every time I ask for help, I'm getting blocked. They're shutting the door on me. What do I do? So I even reached civil rights attorneys and I went to the second court hearing with a retained attorney and I couldn't say anything. I could not express myself at that hearing. All I could say was, I need a civil rights attorney to speak up for me. I need a civil rights attorney to speak up for me because the prosecutors had a gag order in that, and also the other thing is, unusual thing is, every time I went to request I tried to bring up my Sixth Amendment, constitutional rights for an effective lawyer, effective conflict-free counsel, the prosecutors were there telling the judge what to do. And that was very unusual. And that happened in all the 3 hearings where my effective lawyers were denied. And many of the lawyers even legal experts who reviewed my cases for law journals and things like that, and they're still reviewing it. And they said, why did the prosecutor interfere in your attorney, in your effective attorney request to the judge? Because that's your Sixth Amendment rights. They had no business telling the judge what to do. And it was very obvious because it happened the 3rd time during when attorney Mark Shamel and his counsel was there, the prosecutors were there in the courtroom, and they were telling the judge, do not allow substitution for Dr. Ganesh. And in fact, Mark Shamel, even during the audio recording with the judge, argued and said, look, prosecutors are not supposed to interfere. This hearing is between Dr. Ganesh and the judge and the new counsel who wants to substitution of counsel. Why is the government dictating, telling the judge, don't allow substitution, do not allow substitution? No, this is, so they were trying, the prosecutors were at every hearing blocking my Sixth Amendment rights. And I heard that was not the way things go. And once again, I'm not a legal expert.
Bring this back kind of to the trial. So do we have a sense, Lisa, having reviewed the trial record, why the jury ruled the way they did?
My sense of it is exactly what you said when we were talking about this earlier. The jury was not going to give them, the government, the healthcare fraud conspiracy, the money laundering conspiracy, and that they just threw the government a bone at the end, thinking, all right, there's these little counts where someone said that they went on one day and they may have, the bill may have set a different date. So, maybe we can convict on this count. I think that's what happened with Dr. Belcher, who's convicted of one single count for, an invoice submitted that said the 23rd when the treatment was the 25th. And then on the 5 instances, I think they gave them the benefit of the doubt and gave them like the low hanging fruit, so to speak, and figured that they
low hanging fruit is now like 5 years in prison.
Right. So
See,
here's the crazy thing about the way things happen in federal court. So, and this is a big issue at sentencing. She essentially got sentenced based on acquitted conduct, because the judge said, if you did these 5 things, then you must have done this for 4 years. And so
and the most important thing.
Hang on, Dr. Ganesh.
Okay.
She came up with a loss amount of $600,000 based on what she felt was an average of what must have happened over 4 years, and then sentenced her to 63 months based on that. So, I mean, that's always been an argument throughout this, is that you shouldn't be sentencing people based on acquitted conduct, which is exactly what that is for both of them. And the same for Dr. Belcher. The restitution for Dr. Belcher in his case is $251. And for that, he was sentenced to 1 year and a day in federal prison. And so, for both of them, we're penalized in the sentence context for acquitted conduct. But why did the jury do what they did? I don't know. I also, because I didn't do the trial, I didn't have a feel for the jury. They clearly rejected the bulk of the government's argument, the nut of their case, they rejected, which, I don't know. Jurors do that sometimes. They split the baby. It was not a win for the government, so to speak, except that they're extracting not only federal convictions, which impact both of their abilities to practice medicine, obviously, but substantial custodial sentences.
The other most, during the trial, what happened was my attorney provided absolutely no defense, whatsoever. He had no defense. And the jury thought that the jury, acquitted me on those other big counts. And they got these 5 counts of healthcare fraud because they actually, in the jury note, it says no defense was provided. There was no defense explanations provided by my trial attorney. And also, the trial attorney never addressed the 5 criminal counts, never throughout the trial, not a single time in closing argument. He completely ignored this complete 5 counts. He provided 0 defense. And to make it all worse, what he did was, during the opening statement, even before the prosecutor presented any evidence to the jury, in his opening statement, my trial attorney, I have the transcripts, and Lisa has sure seen the transcripts. It says, hi, I'm Mr. Horowitz. I'm a trial attorney for Dr. Ganesh. I agree with everything the government is going to present. I agree with everything what the prosecutors are going to say. I swear to God, this is what he said. It was so horrific that, you know, the attorney, Mr. Reardon, who my husband, Dr. Belcher, had retained, that he had in his opening brief, can you believe a defense attorney, trial attorney, Dr. Ganesh's trial attorney saying, I agree with the prosecutors on everything before any single witness was presented in trial, before anybody testified. This is what he did. And I knew right then he threw me under the bus. So I told him immediately to go home, leave my trial. I don't want you present. I do not want you to represent me anymore. Please get out of the trial. I don't need you. And then I told the judge, I will represent myself. I don't want this lawyer. And the judge said, no, he's started the trial. He's going to go all the way down. And the other most important thing is that was the biggest factor. There's no defense at all for those counts. And the other thing is, you know, the jury, the biggest thing was when the government decided, you know, when they saw how the case was going, when they could not prove their evident theory of healthcare fraud in trial, because all the SIU agents, office staff, and patients gave stellar testimonies. They didn't agree with the government, and nobody said healthcare fraud was committed. None of the patients, none of the officer, even the insurance agent said, yes, insurance company refused payments for Dr. Ganesh since 2012. It's on the transcripts. So while this was going on, prosecutors figured that they're going to lose the trial. So then they brought in these huge volumes and volumes and volumes of they brought in this electronic evidence spreadsheets, which is the biggest culprit of this case. And those were the 40,000 false evidence, fabricated evidence of patient records that were taken from an entirely different doctor's office, completely unrelated, which were never submitted, not submitted by Dr. Ganesh or Dr. Belcher. And those records were fabricated and presented to the jury. And they started showing these volumes and volumes of claims, which we had nothing to do, telling the jury, arguing to the jury, look at all these thousands of claims Dr. Ganesh and Dr. Belcher submitted. You see how they defrauded the insurance company. You see how they committed fraud. You see how they did this fraud. So they went on and on and on repeatedly, badgering the jury with this 40,000 false claims of various spreadsheets from the insurance company's data. And they were presenting this over and over again. And again, repeatedly in closing arguments as well, they were presenting this false evidence, enormous spreadsheets, 40,000 spreadsheets to the jury, saying this is all fraud by Dr. Ganesh and Belcher. And what happened during the trial was, when they showed these claims, 40,000 claims, they showed the money column and the payment column and the billed column. They completely redacted or pretty much blacked out the doctor's name, the patient's name, and the tax ID numbers were all covered up in black. Nobody could see that. So they were just scrolling these 40,000 numerous records throughout the trial saying, look at the fraud, and kind of talking, repeatedly saying that to the jury over and over again, showing these thousands of claims, scrolling up and down all the fraud. And then even they did that in closing argument. So they led the jury to believe that these were healthcare fraud crimes of Ganesh and Belcher. But then after the trial, almost a couple of weeks after the trial, when they were preparing for sentencing, one of my husband's trial attorney found out, oh my God, these claims look weird, because those were all these 40,000 spreadsheets of claims were used for sentencing. Prosecutors said these are going to be presented in sentencing. And the other most important thing is also, prosecutors never presented a HCFA 1500 form, which is a mandatory form. And in fact, one of the post-trial defense attorneys talked to the American Healthcare Council and the American Medical Association and said, there has been no convictions that's holding up without a proof of a HCFA 1500 form that shows that doctor did submit these fraudulent claims. So there was no HCFA form in our case.
Step in
1500 form.
Just about out of time, but I did
so
want
that's
to
another big.
I do want to raise one more point here, which I think is instructive. So, what I'm hearing here is that on the one hand, the defense attorney really didn't put on much of a defense.
None.
And despite that, she still got acquitted on the major charges, which, you know, I think could be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you could argue that that's just how weak the government's case was, which I think is what your guys' point would be. But the government can come back and say, wait a second, if he's so ineffective, why did she get acquitted on the major charges? So that may play against you at the Supreme Court. What are your thoughts on that?
So let me talk about that, because that's a real interesting point. I think and just fast forwarding through. So when we started litigating, wait a second, you submitted somebody else's claims as evidence of fraud in this case that has nothing to do with these defendants. First, they denied that. Ultimately, they conceded. They conceded in the Ninth Circuit. They agree it happened. They don't tell us why it happened or how it happened or any of that, but they concede that it happened. And then that is exactly their position. It's like, well, it doesn't really matter because neither of them were convicted on the healthcare conspiracy count, the big nut. And they also say that they should have noticed this before trial. They said they blame it on these defendants for not noticing it and say it's too late to raise, like there were motions for new trial filed when all this was discovered, and they said, no, you can't, you should have known this before trial. So I think the more interesting thing, and that was their position on appeals, yeah, it happened, but it doesn't matter because they weren't convicted of anything. But I disagree with that. I disagree with that because I think that it's clear from the verdict that the jurors compromised, that they weren't going to give the government this big thing, but they're going to like say, okay, we'll give you a little something. And the jurors probably, if you interviewed them, would have no idea that these people would be sentenced to 63 months or even a year for Dr. Belcher.
Or even there was fraudulent evidence that was given presented at trial. The jury.
Okay, hang on. Let me finish my thought here for David Vilasni.
Okay.
So I think it matters because it makes the entire specter of the trial unfair, right? The entire thing that happened. And plus the government doesn't get to just fraudulently submit evidence and make evidence up. I mean, it appears they actually manufactured a spreadsheet to make it look a certain way. And they don't get to just do that, right? There has to be a penalty. So you don't get to just do that and then see, well, if they're not, and then later say, if they're not convicted of that, what does it matter? It matters. It matters that we have integrity in our judicial system and that we have a basic. It
also matters that it's prejudicing the jury. Right. One of the reasons that the jury may have compromised was that they thought something happened.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so if you had just gone in with these discrete acts where they had a patient who, was the patient seen on this date or this date that's on the claim form, whether a jury would have convicted him of that, I don't know. If you had an attorney who was actually defending that and making proper arguments on that, it could have been a whole different trial. But the interesting thing about this is clearly she has ineffective assistance of counsel issues that she's going to get to raise in a post-conviction context after the US Supreme Court petition, if that's not successful. So she clearly has these IAC claims she can raise. And then I don't know what the government's going to say because they've already basically blamed it on her lawyer for not noticing it, not noticing their errors to begin with. But as I have maintained all along, it's not like the issue is not whether or not they did this, they did it. The issue is whether or not they did it negligently, on accident, or intentionally on purpose. Because if they did it intentionally and on purpose, she has a right, both of them have a right to an outright dismissal of this case, not just a retrial. And so, and those are the different standards. And that's what an evidentiary hearing needs to ferret out and mete out, because that's never been resolved. And the district court doesn't want to hear it. And the Ninth Circuit wasn't interested in hearing it. And that's a post-conviction issue that has to be determined in the context now of IAC.
All right, we're almost out of time, but I gotta get to this last issue here. And it's one that the doctors raised a number of times. Where do you see the racial component here? Because
yes,
I mean, there has to be some sort of motivation here, because this whole thing looks terrible.
Yes.
From an outsider's perspective.
Yes, that's exactly what a lot of legal experts have said, that this is a horrific case of injustice. And it's because, Gregory Beltram Heston, he's a Black American, and I'm a woman of color, I'm a racial minority. And the way the justice system works, we have learned is Blacks and minorities are treated as inferior, inferior class in the justice system in the United States. And as you can see, we were treated badly in the district court, the judge misconduct in the district court, Judge Lucy Co misconduct in the district court, and in the exaggeration of the sentencing, and her sentencing on false evidence and phony loss calculations. And as I had produced in journal articles and in the news media, and I sent you a copy as well, where the spreadsheets that she sentenced me on 38B was another fraudulent spreadsheet, and it says check issued to unknown bank accounts, and check issued dates are 12/31/8888, and which makes absolutely no sense. And for her to pull out a 63-month sentencing on a completely phony spreadsheets, and the prosecutors during the sentencing said, we're not even sure what Dr. Ganesh's loss calculation is. And I said, my loss calculations are zero because insurance company deprived me of payments. I had a civil litigation, and there's a trial testimony from the insurance company saying Dr. Ganesh never refused payments to Dr. Ganesh. Insurance company refused payments to Dr. Ganesh since 2012. It's on the trial testimony. So there is no, there's no loss calculations. I do not deserve any prison time whatsoever. But the judge disagreed, and she was very highly abusive, and she's very highly prejudiced against me. And I understand that she's had some very racial hate and prejudice towards other women who are racial minority Indian American citizens like myself. And that's been a very big issue. And the other thing is, we were hoping and praying and pleading for justice in the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit completely denied our justice for us. And
so is there anything that can be done before November 10th?
No.
No.
Her petition for cert is due in the Supreme Court by October 30th. There's no way that's going to be resolved before November 10th.
So she's going into prison no matter what.
She has to go into prison, and she has remedies, and she has good remedies and things to pursue, and there are good claims, but it's not going to stave off her custodial sentence.
And the worst part of all this is, we have 3 very young children, minor children, and this is horrific to be sentencing a mother of 3 children to prison based on zero loss calculations or checks given on 12/31/8888, which makes no sense. And this clearly proves that this is an enormous judge misconduct. If a judge sentences people on this type of thing, a black defendant, Black American, my husband, and I'm an Indian American, and if she sentences us on these type of things, it's just horrific. It is beyond belief that the judge would not even review the loss calculations properly, and would not even look at open an eyes and look at the checks issued on 12/31/8888 on the spreadsheets and say, okay, 5 years in prison. It is unheard of. And in fact, I'm speaking out to a lot of physicians organizations are very angry and upset with this thing. And especially with a 63 months prison sentence, they said this is horrific. This is horror on anybody, on any extent or any length, is to send someone to prison based on phony loss calculations where there were no losses, and there were fake spreadsheets showing checks issued 12/31/8888, and there's thousands of those things that were shown, and the judge sees that and says, okay, Dr. Ganesh is sentencing to prison. That is the most outrageous thing. And once again, going back to the prejudice and abuse and things like that.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I really want to thank you for sharing your story. We're going to get it out there into the media, and hopefully we can make the system work properly here. Any quick thoughts, Lisa?
David, thanks so much for having us on today. I really appreciate it. I think this case is important because it sheds light on government misconduct. And it's been incredibly frustrating that, you know, I think, and this goes to the race thing as well, courts and the system, and sometimes even jurors, maybe want to give the government the benefit of the doubt and assume that the government wouldn't make mistakes, but they clearly did in this case. And I think it's been hard, if not impossible, for the court to look at it through that lens, like to just even assume for a minute that maybe the government did something wrong. And then I think when you layer that with the fact that both of these defendants are racial minorities, becomes easier, I think, for people to discount what they're saying and to actually hear what they're saying. And that's how I think race plays into it.
All right. Well, Dr. Ganesh, hang in there. Dr.
Thank
Belcher,
you so much for your
thanks
support.
for joining us
And
today.
thank you for the
And,
opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thanks, David.
thank you.
Thank you.
This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.